Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 171 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to talk about social media and hiking. Now, everyone has their own reason or reasons for hiking, and these can include things like exercise, getting a bit of solitude, taking in scenic views. For many people, photography also forms part of getting out bush, and sometimes this might be the main reason, with the focus being taking photos of wildlife or sunrises. At other times, it might be just a minor reason, with the odd photo taken as a means of remembering the activity or the particular hike that you've been on. Now, social media in itself isn't a negative use of photography, and certainly from Jill and my perspective, our initial engagement with social media was like many other people in being in contact with our family to find out what was going on. Over recent years, there's been a trend of taking photographs not for the purpose of remembering a hike, for getting high-impact photos that extend social media reach. In itself, that isn't an issue, but it does become one when people risk their lives or damage the environment just to get that special photo. In this episode, we discuss the negative impacts of social media and look at ways we can minimise those. We hope you enjoy. There's probably two main negative reasons that social media can have on the environment and hiking. The first one is environmental damage. Now, just as an example here, the highly popular overland track is one of those tracks where you can almost describe it as being loved to death. And a number of years ago, there was no permitting system on the overland track, and the final straw that broke the camel's back from the Tasmanian Parks organisation was that 200 people turned up to the first campsite on one day.
Yeah, it's not a big campsite, is it?
No. I mean, given that the hut itself sleeps about 24 at a maximum, and the external area just doesn't cater with that. So with sites like the overland track and other high visitation sites, the mechanisms that were put in place to protect these sort of tracks include having a permitting system, which limits the number of people that are going to impact on a track or a particular area at a given time, and also the inclusion of things like boardwalks and constructed trails, again, just to try and minimise the impact.
Yeah, and keep people on the trail and manage the numbers. And it's a really interesting one because it does create a lot of debate within the sector about people who, don't think they need to be managed and think, it's kind of a bit over the top. So permitting and making supposedly the hiking easier through a boardwalk rather than necessarily appreciating the minimising the impact by creating, I guess, formed trails that people have to follow.
I was at a meeting a few years ago and talking to staff from Tasmanian Parks, and we were talking about the South Coast track in Tasmania, and it's certainly recognised as being a wilderness trail, but there is discussion about putting in boardwalks, putting in huts and formed campsites on this trail just because of the sheer amount of damage that hikers are actually putting on this particular area. So, I mean, I think in that respect, loving trails to death can be managed. You can actually limit the number of people that access a site in a particular time. You can actually use things like the boardwalks. And these are all things that can be managed quite well.
And I guess the point here is that people have seen images about, some of these iconic spots and it draws them to them. So, images on social media have the effect of attracting attention and attracting more visitation. So, you can't ban the images on social media, So you have to manage the impact.
And I think it doesn't matter what sort of mechanisms you put in place, you've got to assume, or you can only assume, that people are going to follow the recommendations. So putting in fences, putting in signs, you hope that people obey those and don't go and climb them, or don't go into areas they shouldn't.
People do people things.
I think so, yeah. So walking off boardwalks or marked trails to get a particular photo can have that environmental damage. Now, in the written version of this podcast, there's an example of, there's a couple of examples actually that we've actually gone through and referenced. One was of the Californian poppy super bloom, and there's been a couple of those over the last few years. And there was an instance in 2019 where the conditions, the weather conditions, the environment was at such a point where the bloom of the Californian poppies had just been so good that everyone wanted to get out and take photos. And there's an article we've quoted out of the Los Angeles Times that says, "Stubborn enough to go see the poppy bloom, at least stay on the trail." And the cover image of that article has someone actually lying in the middle of the poppies, actually off the trail. And what's happening here is this is only one individual, but they're actually going through and crushing poppies in that particular area. And given the sheer number of people doing the same sort of thing, the damage is being replicated across a large area. There was even an example in that same year of somebody landing a helicopter in the middle of the blooming poppy field. Yes, that's it's going to limit the number of
It's not just the poppies that are going to get destroyed in all of that.
No, and it's not just the treads of the actual helicopter, it's the wind that are destroying everything as well. And apparently when the rangers went to approach the helicopter took off and disappeared just so they wouldn't get fined.
Well, except don't they have registration numbers on the side of?
They do, and in this case here it was actually a media helicopter, and they spoke to the media agency concerned. Closer to home, the Mount Kosciuszko walk from the top of the ski lift up to the summit of Mount Kosciuszko. Alpine areas tend to be fairly sensitive.
Yeah.
They tend to be slow growing, and any damage you get tends to repair quite slowly.
And also the growing season is actually quite short as well.
It is. So in that sort of instance there, from the chairlift pretty much up to at least probably 2/3 of the way towards the summit, you're on a formed mesh track. And providing you don't go off the track, you're limiting the impact that's having on that trail. So, I mean, in that particular walk, it's usually the case where people tend to stay on the boardwalk. And once the boardwalk finishes, you're then on Management Road that takes you to that final bit up to the summit. So in that case of Mount Kosciuszko, where you have tens of thousands of people walking that summit and walking that trail over a period of the warmer months, if the track or the tread wasn't there, you just have a permanently warm trail. Yeah. It would get braided, it would get wide, you'd start to get erosion and runoff. So putting that trail in, while it actually has an impact, by physically putting the trail in, the damage is actually much less, and the long-term protection of the environment is actually much better.
Well, it's one of these funny things, isn't it? Because it contains the volume of people to the track, but in a perverse kind of way, it also makes it easier to access as well, which attracts more people. So it's kind of this funny sort of circular thing that goes on, I think. But in the long run, I think boardwalks in particular have proven to be essential in protecting sensitive areas.
Now, in addition to environmental damage, we can also do cultural damage. For those people that have walked around Uluru, you'll come across images saying, "This is a culturally sensitive site, please do not take photos."
Yeah.
So as a result, you're not likely to see huge numbers of photos of that particular area of the rock on social media. So potentially, by taking photos, you're going to be showing something that isn't commonly seen, and potentially would be, it would encourage people to go through and look at it. But again, it's encouraging bad cultural practices. The traditional owners have asked that people don't go through and take photos and don't approach this area. And it's just a matter of good manners and courtesy. that in that sort of situation, you don't necessarily, as much as you want to, you don't necessarily go in and take photos.
Yeah, and I think we talk about respect, and I think that's an aspect. But it's a privilege that you're being given an opportunity to go and have a look, and really value that privilege in the way that you're being asked to value it. And I don't think that's a bad thing. You don't go into someone's home and you take photos. For me, that's the analogy that I would use. You don't go into someone's backyard and take photos. So why would you do that in such special places and places with such meaning?
While people can have serious environmental impacts by their activities, many people take the pursuit of capturing good social media images to the extreme, and in doing so put themselves at physical risk and even death. Now, what prompted this podcast was within the last week of this podcast being produced, there was an article in the media about the death of a walker who'd gone to a lookout, who'd bypassed the fence to have a photo taken on a very prominent location that's very popular. They, from what I understand from reading the articles in the media, they tripped and actually fell off the cliff and ended up dying. That in itself seems to be a common sort of thing, not so much the deaths, but
it's a very sad thing.
It is a very sad thing, but I think it's more the issue that so many people do this. And if you actually go onto the Instagram and some of the other social media platforms, you'll see so many images of people sitting on the edge of this cliff having their photo taken. There's one image which I came across in particular, which was a video of somebody standing virtually about 30 centimetres in from the edge of this cliff edge, and they did a backflip. They may have been the world's best gymnast. I don't know.
I don't know whether they look like that. I mean, they could do a decent backflip, but still, you'd have to be pretty good and pretty confident, wouldn't you?
Yeah, all you'd need is just one misstep or one incident, and he could have gone
just a slip. Yeah,
it's just a slip, and he could have actually gone over the edge. Now, in this instance here, this image has had a lot of social media likes and interaction, but what it really is saying is, hey, if I do this really dangerous thing, I get lots of social media interaction. Now, in Sydney, south of Sydney, there's a site called Wedding Cake Rock in Royal National Park, and it's a similar sort of location. There are fences up there to stop people getting to the edge of the cliff. There are signs that very clearly point out the dangers, and people still bypass this to get a photo sitting on the edge of the rock. And we have used an image from social media showing an example of this, all in the sake of getting a good social media image. So people will often say, well, what's the problem? Now, Wedding Cake Rock in particular, there is a very clear warning sign that states that the geotechnical experts, and I assume they mean geologists here, are basically saying they're just waiting for this rock formation just to fall into the ocean. I think it's more a matter of not if it will do it, it's when more than anything else. And you've only got to look at photos of this particular piece of rock formation from particular angles, and there's a large crack. And it doesn't look like it would take much for it to, too many people on there or whatever for this thing to go. And if people happen to be on there at the particular time, they'll go with it.
And I think this was one a few years ago where there was a stack of people who were, getting the image, and it actually did make the news. And the rangers were trying to clear, so they'd, started a bit of a frenzy, people climbing over the fence, and there was more than a couple of people standing on this piece that, had the potential to fall. Some would say, well, it didn't, so it's kind of okay. But, yeah, when I saw the image of this, or the video footage on the news a few years ago, it was like just madness and crazy. And I think also 2020 has been such a weird year. lots of people suddenly being able to get out and about also had an impact on, I think, some crazy things that people were doing. Thank God I can now get out of, my house or my yard, or and I can stand on this cliff and take a photo and tell everybody I'm out here. So, it's a really hard one because you can appreciate the excitement about being let loose in 2020, but I think there's been a very dangerous uprise in this practice.
All right, ignoring the fact that this rock is at some point going to fall into the ocean. I mean, it may not happen for years, who knows? But again, it becomes the issue that if you get too close to the edge and you trip or you slip, you're risking your life. If that's not enough, if you are caught by the rangers, you're potentially up for a $3,000 fine. And I mean, that in itself is probably a good enough indication that it's something you probably shouldn't do. Now, the other issue here is ignoring potential safety issues to yourself. If you want to take the risk, certainly that's up to you. But if you do end up injuring yourself or falling and you need to be rescued, you're potentially putting other people at risk who have to go through and rescue, and you're also diverting resources from other accident situations. Things that people, real accidents rather than people putting themselves at risk. Self-created.
Yeah.
Now, we'll be upfront here. We use social media quite heavily to promote our website and our blog, just as many bloggers do. But things we try and avoid is we try not to post images that show unsafe activities. So while it would be good to go and get a really wonderful photo, and we may get more hits, it's setting a bad precedent. We don't tend to encourage unsafe activities. So again, we don't repost images that are showing other unsafe activities. Now, while I've gone through and shown photos in this podcast and the written version of it, it's more to show examples of what not to do. We also don't show activities that damage the environment. So, lying in a field of wildflowers or climbing over a fence to get a photo in the middle of a bush is something we try and avoid at all costs. We tend to stay on the trail unless there is no trail. But usually we all follow the trail wherever it has been set.
Well, one of the things I'd like to emphasise is that the whole point of some of this dangerous photography and posting on social media is about getting that reach and about getting those likes. So one thing that we can do is not like them and not encourage it and not support it. And, that kind of takes away the power of the thing that they're trying to generate and the thing that they're trying to create. So, it's an interesting one, but we can just boycott, I guess, is what I'm saying, the images that we think are damaging the environment or the images that we think are unsafe.
Yeah, so as Jill said, I mean, in talking about that example before, or those couple of examples before, where we talked about the person doing the backflip on the edge of a cliff, that had a huge amount of likes. It went viral. That's the only way you can describe it. It was a extremely large amounts of hits. But what that tends to do is encourage people to go through and repeat those practices just because they know they can get good social media reach. The other example we talked about was poor cultural practices. We have deliberately chosen not to do some walks. Some of the walks in Glasshouse Mountain, the traditional owners have requested that people don't walk to the summits of particular peaks, and as a result, we've accepted that, and we've chosen not to do the walk and not to post images of it as well, because that would be just be encouraging more people to go through and do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one because, the whole point about all of this is acknowledging, what's special and what's precious. And, there are so few and such a reducing number of special and precious things, why do you want to put more pressure on them and encourage more destruction of them?
Okay, so just to finish up this episode, this has only been a short one today. As I said, we do use social media quite heavily, but we try and do it in a responsible way. We do encourage people to think about personal safety and protection of the physical and the cultural environment. This may not get you as many social media hits, but in the long run, it's the responsible thing to do.
Yeah, and if it's family and friends wanting to know, what really special thing that you did on your hike or your trip away, then, maybe do something a little bit old-fashioned and have a conversation about it.
Okay, that's all for this week. We have one more episode left for 2020.
Yay. We're all hoping the end of 2020 is going to be a good end.
And that's going to be in the last few days of the year. So look forward to that. As always, you can listen to this podcast through the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au, through iTunes, through Apple Music, and any other number of podcast hosting services. We hope everyone has a great Christmas and has a good chance to get out hiking. That's all for this week. Bye for now.
And Merry Christmas and bye from me.